Hi and welcome to Rosebread Homestead. You know, I am continually amazed every time I make a new recipe out of the Artisan book by Ken Forkish called Flour, Water, Salt, and Yeast, at how the flavors are so different just using those four and only those four ingredients when we vary one or the other of them a little bit. Some variations can occur when you use different combinations of flours. Like white flour, wheat flour, rye flour, and so forth. The big one, however, is how we vary the fermentation because of the yeast, how we treat that variable. And doing a pre-ferment is one way that we can get amazing and different flavors in artisan breads. Today we are going to be using a pre-ferment that is called Biga, B-I-G-A. And it's a fun pre-ferment, and we'll get started on that when we come back in just a moment. Perhaps some of you have watched our previous video on pre-ferments, the pre-ferment of Poolish. Now, Biga is very different than Poolish. Poolish was quite sticky, quite runny. We could pour it from one bucket into another bucket. Not so with Biga. Biga is much more stiff. It uses more flour and less water. And also with this particular recipe, 80% of the dough is going to be the Biga. And so you won't be surprised to know that I already have 800 grams of flour right here in our 6-quart bucket. Now, because Ken Forkish in his book, every one of his bread recipes for artisan bread always uses 1,000 grams of flour, it's easy to calculate that when we have 800 of those grams right here, this is an 80% pre-ferment. And so it's going to be a lot of fun. This is actually the first time that I have made the recipe with 100% white flour. Every other time that I have made the pre-ferment of Biga, I have used the 50% wheat recipe, and oh my, it is so delicious. So this is going to be a new experience. We're all in this together, and so I'm excited to begin. I'm going to be running through the procedures fairly quickly because I'm assuming and hoping that you have watched already some of our previous videos where I spend a lot more time talking about the procedure. When we come to something that is a little bit new, I will take a little bit more time to explain that. But the flour is pre-measured. I have the water pre-measured. This is 80-degree water that I tested with my little thermometer right here. And we're going to do one thing a little different right here. Now, one of the things that Ken has said in his book, I just reread one of the chapters again last night, and it reminded me of how important it is to use weight instead of volume for measuring the ingredients for artisan bread. And so that's why I'm hoping that you all have now a kitchen scale. But just in case you don't, 8 grams of flour is the same as 6 1/4 cups. And this is 544 grams of 80-degree water, which is the same as 2 1/3 cups. Now, the only exception to that weight rule is when Ken says when you just put a little bit of yeast. Now, in these pre-ferments that we do, and a pre-ferment, you may remember from the Poolish video, is part of the dough that we mix the night before, and it consists of flour, water, and just a little tiny bit of yeast. And then we let that ferment all night long. Now, this pre-ferment is going to be quite different than the Poolish. It is going to develop more alcohol and a little bit stronger scent, according to what is written in Ken's book. Since this is our first time, my first time, we'll see how it actually does. But his suggestion is to use a set of measuring spoons, these little tiny measuring spoons, to do the yeast instead of the weight when the volume of yeast is so tiny. So this little tiny set is 1/8 and 1/16 and 1/32. And the amount of yeast that we need to use is 0.64 grams or 3/16. And so you may know these by other names. The 1/8 is a dash, the 1/16 is a pinch, and the 1/32 is a smidgen. And so we're going to dip right into our yeast, and we're going to get 3 of these 1/16 measures of yeast, and I'm going to put it just in this little tiny bowl. So there's 1, 2, and 3. Now this differs from the procedure that we usually use. We usually just spread the yeast out over the flour, but because this is a more stiff dough, we need to pre-soften the yeast just a little bit. So I'm going to dip into our full amount of water. I don't want to get additional water from the faucet because that would disturb our recipe. And I'm just going to stir this with my finger, let it soften just a bit. One of the other things that I read in that chapter, reread in that chapter, was how important temperature is. And I had sort of forgotten that. But one of the reasons why we use a particular temperature of water is to bring the dough to a certain temperature. And all of his suggestions are based on a kitchen being about 65 at night and about 70 in the daytime. And I just took the ambient temperature here, and it is 70 degrees. So it is still 70 degrees, and I do know that first thing in the morning when I come out here it's 65 degrees. So we should be just about right on the money in terms of how warm or what the temperature of the bread will be overnight. And that is an indicator of how long it will need to proof tomorrow. So this yeast is ready, and I'm going to just dump it right here in our bucket. And you notice that there is still some left in the bowl, so I'm going to take the rest of what I got out and stir this around. We want to save every bit of yeast and every drop of the water. And so there we go, that's the last of the yeast. And I'm going to set this aside, and here's the rest of our water, and I'm going to dump it right in our bucket too. Now if you followed our other videos on artisan bread, you know what's next. I'm going to reach my hand, which is clean, right in this bucket, and I'm just going to mix this until the flour is incorporated with the water. That's our first step. You know, you would hardly think that 3/16 of a teaspoon of yeast is going to do very much, but if we've done our work right in the morning after 14 hours, that's about 6:15 right now, so we'll come out here in the morning a little bit after 8 and do the next steps. But we should find a lot of visible response to the yeast, because this dough should have tripled in bulk and be a little bit domed on the top. It's going to look very different than the poolish, if any of you have watched that other video. That poolish was very sticky, mixing it up at this point, and then when we loosened it from the sides of this bucket to get it into the larger bucket to join with the remaining ingredients, we could just pour it right in. In fact, if you look at the opening image of the video on poolish, you'll see what we did when we just poured it right into the larger bucket. Okay, so this is pretty mixed now, pretty incorporated, but this takes a little bit more muscle because it's such a stiff dough. And I'm going to wet my hands just a little bit so the dough doesn't stick so much to my hands. And now we are going to do what we regularly do, which is to start folding the dough, and this is to help mix it. And I just reach under the dough, bring it up over the top, and then push forward. And so it's just like a folding, exactly what the name suggests. So I'm going to fold and turn the bucket at least all the way around. There's a little bit of flour in some of the crevices here that I'm trying to pick up as I go. And I turn it, and now I'm going to pinch it. And this is putting little segments in it, like a caterpillar is how I have described it. And then once I've pinched, I'm going to fold it again, turning the bucket around as I go. So I'm getting a different edge all the time. Wow, this is stiff. Good workout. Okay, now the bucket is getting clean. Okay, now pinching. I'm really anxious to try this. 80% of the whole dough, of the full amount, is in the Biga. So pinch, 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 and dampen hands, and then fold again. All right, and one more pinch. And now the last folding all the way around. And flop it over. All right, I'm going to push it down a little bit so that we can sort of see on the measurement side. Okay, if I hold that measurement side up to the camera, you can pretty much see that if there was a measurement for about 1 quart or 1 liter, that's about where this dough would be. So in the morning, it should be about tripled in bulk, and we should see all kinds of bubbles on the top. Not the same kind of bubbles as on the Polish. These are going to be larger and a little bit better formed. On the Polish, we could just watch the top of it and see those bubbles pop up. They were smaller in size than a pencil eraser, but these are going to be larger and not quite so popping. So here's the lid. And that's the first step. We're done. And so we'll come back at 8 o'clock in the morning and see what we have. So I'll see you then. Good morning. It's 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, and would you look to see what our Biga did overnight? Tripled in size easily. So here we have it, just that little bit of yeast that we put in last night. So now I'm going to smell it. I have not smelled this. Oh yeah, it's very rich, very earthy. I can smell the alcohol, and the top is lumpy bumpy. It's not quite what I expected. The bubbles are below the surface. I sort of expected more bubbling on the very surface, but didn't happen. It was a little bit domed until just now. It kind of, when I set it down, it deflated just a little bit. So according to the description in the book that I use, this is just about perfect. Now over here in our big bucket, I have put 200 grams of white flour, 206 grams of water is waiting right here on my scale, ready to go in, and this is 105-degree water. So we're going to be bringing the temperature of the dough upward. And then I've also mixed in with this flour 22 grams of salt, which is 1 tablespoon plus 1 teaspoon, and then 2 grams of yeast, which is an even 1/2 teaspoon. And then I just mixed it around with my hands. So the flour and the yeast and the salt, and this is such a little tiny bit of flour left because most of the dough is right here in the Biga. So here is the salt that I used. It is fine sea salt. And then the yeast, which I used, and I'm just going to set them aside. And so this water, pre-measured, I'm going to just pour it right into the 12-quart tub and set the scale aside. And so then I'm just going to reach in here and mix this with my fingers and just until it's barely incorporated. And there's not enough to do anything except just barely mix it together. So here we just have this little dab of dough. Now the next thing we do is we're going to take our Biga and we're going to put it right in here and mix these two together. So I'm going to loosen it from the sides, and we don't just dump this. This is very stiff, but boy, it's so light, full of gas. So I'm just going to help this so that it doesn't drop in there. see if I can gather up a little bit of this remainder in here. Not much is left. Now, the trick is going to be to combine these two doughs. So, since I haven't done this before, I kind of don't know what to expect, but we're going to do the usual folding. Now, when we do this kind of a folding and pinching, like we did yesterday, this is to mix the dough. So we are combining these two and mixing them together. This little dab, this 200 grams of flour that we did this morning, is going to make the dough just a little bit less stiff. I can already start feeling that. So I'm folding and pinching until all of this gets mixed together. I'm going to continue doing this off camera until this gets all done, and then I'll bring you back to show you what it is like when we let it start its proofing period. This is just about done. It has taken me about 4 minutes off camera to get this ready. The doughs are all now incorporated together. It feels one texture all throughout. So I'm doing the last folding right now and the last pinching. And then I'm going to gather it all together and turn it upside down. At this point, it has about the same consistency that the Polish did at this point, and that is because the hydration of both doughs are the same. We used a total of 75% water to 100% flour. The flour was 1,000 grams, the total water was 750 grams, and so we have a 75% hydration. So it's just about the same. Now what needs to happen next is we need to develop the gluten. So I am going to come back every 20 minutes for 3 times, and I'm just going to fold it. No pinching, just the folding. And the folding will develop the gluten and make the dough much more elastic and a whole lot less sticky. Now I'm going to do most of that off camera, but I will come back on the very last folding so you can see what that is like, and we'll go from there. Well, it's 9:25. It's about an hour and a half since we first mixed the dough, and we are ready to do our very last fold before we let it proof. So I'm dampening my hands, and the gluten is really developing well, and it has become a much more smooth dough. So we'll just do this one last fold. And doing these folds only takes about 1 minute. We just go around a couple, 3 times. So this is a very easy part. It's important after you reach under the dough to pull it and then bring it back forward again. That really helps the gluten. Now I suspect that it will take another hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, to let this proof all the way. And during that last hour, we never ever do any folding. We leave it alone during that last hour. So I'm going to flop this upside down and put the lid back on. And we'll be back in about an hour and a half to 2 hours when this has doubled in bulk and we'll be ready to shape it. So I will see you then. We're back and it is 11:30. So it has been 3.5 hours since we mixed our final dough, and this was a little bit longer, but it's okay. I think the kitchen was a little cooler this morning than usual. Normally this would have to rise only, or it should have been only 3 hours, but that's all right. We let the dough tell us when the time is right. We don't go by the clock. But this now has risen to double its volume, and so we are ready to shape these loaves. And this much dough will make 2 loaves, as usual. And notice my roses. Honestly, that Jim, he went into town this morning and brought those back and surprised me yet again. He does that all the time, just for no special reason. So it's just really great. So anyway, I'm going to just sprinkle a little bit of water on the top of, not water, this happens to be flour, not water, a little bit of flour on the top of the dough, and then I'm going to put some more down here and give me a little pile over there so that I have room to, some to dip my fingers in if I need to. Notice also I have my Dutch ovens right here. The proofing time for once they get in the proofing baskets will only be about an hour. And since I need to preheat the oven, the recipe calls for 475 degrees, but my oven runs a little bit hot, so I preheat it to 465 for 45 minutes. So I will need to be putting these in the oven in about 15 minutes after we are done here. So I got them out and have them ready to go into the oven. Okay, now with floured hands this time and not wet hands, I am going to ease the dough out of the bucket, helping it every step of the way. It's very bubbly now. And that's got almost all of it. You might be able to see these little bubbles right here on the top. So I'm going to arrange it as evenly distributed as I can, and then I'm going to reach over here and get my dough cutter. So here is the dough cutter, and I'm going to run the blade through a little bit of flour, and I'm going to try to cut this in half as equally as I can. And now I'm going to set one half off to the side, and I'm going to work just with this half. And if you've seen other videos, this, whoa, look at that bubble. Whew. It's always fun to pinch the bubbles down. If you've seen our other videos, you know this procedure. So I'm just going to show you what to do with just one of these, and then I'll do the other one off camera, and then we will come back after they have proofed. So I'm doing sort of a very delicate folding, and I'm popping a lot of bubbles while I'm doing that. And the purpose of this is now to form it into a ball. And remember that with artisan bread, it's called a boule. That's French. And it doesn't take very long. Wow, this dough is really easy to work with. Then I'm going to come over here to the part of the countertop that does not have any flour, and I'm going to pull it toward me. The bottom sticks to the countertop, which allows me to create a lot of tension going across the top here. And this further forms it into a ball. And now we have this beautiful little ball, and I'm going to take my proofing basket here and just sprinkle a little bit of flour around and lift the ball right into the proofing basket. And then I'm going to cover it with this grocery bag, this plastic grocery bag, and I'm going to put it over in the windowsill where the sun is coming in. And these will proof for about 1 hour, and when they are ready to go in the oven, we'll be back. It took quite a bit longer for these to proof this time than the book said that it would. In fact, almost double. It's been about 1 hour and 45 minutes, and these are now ready to go in the oven. So I have taken the plastic off of them. Now I'm going to open up the oven and remove the lids from the Dutch ovens one at a time, and I'll show you how I put these in the oven. those pans are very, very hot. So this part, you need to be extremely careful. So this is what they look like. And this is now the bottom that was in the basket. And we're going to put the top down, and I'm folding it almost in half and dropping it in so my hands didn't get burned. And then putting the lid back on. The reason that we cook in these Dutch ovens is so that the steam will make that really crusty crust. You can see how hot those are with the smoke coming. So inverting this basket into my hand, and then I'm bending it up so that I can put it in and it doesn't hurt it at all. Being very careful not to catch my hands. Got a little dough on my hands there. And now we're putting it in the oven. Okay, now these will bake for 30 minutes. At the end of 30 minutes, I come and take the lids off, and they cook again. They bake for an additional 12 to 15 minutes, depending on how dark we want them. Now, I have not ever done this before, but I am going to come in and take a still picture of what the loaves look like right after I take the lids off. And then we will come back to the video when we're ready to take them out of the oven. So we'll see you then. These came out of the oven just a moment ago, and sadly we lost our sound. We're trying out a new microphone and it just crackled all over the place, so we cut that part out. But if you want to see how we get them out of the oven and bring them over here, you can just watch the tail end of one of our other videos, like the Polish video. So we're just going to let these cool for a few moments, well, probably more like 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and cut one open to see what the crumb is like on the inside. Time to see what the crumb looks like. So I'm going to put this loaf over here. This bread is still warm, and I'm going to open it up about right here. Crumbs are flying everywhere, but can you hear that crusty crust? So here is what the crumb looks like. Very even. A few big bubbles. That is the process of using a pre-ferment called a Biga. So we'll taste this and see how it is, and we will see you next time.